Of all the subatomic particles currently known to modern physics, the neutrino has to be one of the most amazing. In fact, the neutrino is so amazing that I would even go so far as to call it godlike. Of all the properties we typically associate with God, the neutrino actually shares an eerie similarity with many of them. It is therefore a worthwhile exercise to explore these similarities and elucidate on the differences between the two. For example, consider the detectability of the neutrino. Because the neutrino has zero charge and virtually no mass to speak of, the neutrino is one of the most inert little buggers in existence. We're talking about a particle so tiny that if you had a block of lead, 1 light year in thickness, a single neutrino could pass through the entire block with only a 50-50 chance of running into anything. Consequently, neutrinos are very difficult to observe directly, and for many years could only be inferred through their effects on the nuclear reactions that generated them. By loose analogy, God is very much the same way. No one ever actually meets or interacts with God directly, but simply infers his existence through his apparent effects in our lives. Now consider the prevalence of the neutrino. Because neutrinos are a byproduct of nuclear reactions, every star in the universe is spewing forth huge numbers of neutrinos every second. In fact, so many neutrinos are permeating all of space that as many as 50 trillion of them pass through your body every second. So in a very real sense, we could even go so far as to say that neutrinos are omnipresent. There is virtually nowhere in the universe one could hide to get away from them. Sound familiar? Because this is very similar to the sort of omnipresence typically ascribed to God. Now think about the human attempts to directly observe neutrinos. Despite neutrinos being so elusive, the sheer volume of them penetrating throughout all space means that, at least on occasion, some lucky neutrino will periodically strike another particle and leave a characteristic trace of that event. Vast detectors have therefore been constructed all over the world in an effort to detect these events, and many data samples have been collected. By analogy, great observatories for God have been constructed all over the world as well. Only let's call them cathedrals, synagogues, mosques, and temples. Although they do not detect God in the same sense that we detect neutrinos, they are, in a sense, designed for the sole purpose of interacting with God. And just like the neutrino detections, miraculous interactions are very rare events that cannot be produced on demand, but do seem to recur at fairly regular intervals. That is to say, people all over the world regularly report signs, voices, impressions, and manifestations of God in their lives. So by a fair approximation, neutrinos and God are very much analogous. Both are intrinsically difficult to observe directly, both are omnipresent throughout the universe, both have vast facilities throughout the world dedicated to generating manifestations, and reports of their interactions are apparently random, though fairly regular. So why is it that all around the world, the existence of the neutrino is a matter of undisputed fact, while the existence of God is hotly contested? What are the fundamental differences between these two concepts that makes one so easy to accept and the other so difficult? The answer to this question is worth serious consideration because it illustrates many of the fundamental rules by which we generate knowledge as opposed to superstition. For starters, consider the consistency of properties ascribed to neutrinos as compared to God. If you ask a physicist in Japan and a physicist in Germany about the general behavior of the average neutrino, odds are that both will give you the same description. All over the world, there is a consensus among physicists about nearly all properties of the neutrino. Yet if you ask a priest in Northern Ireland about the very name of God himself, the answer may vary significantly from what a Brahmin in southern India might say. One theologian might call him Yahweh, while another might insist on referring to him as Krishna. Some theologians may describe God as an ethereal spirit, while others describe him as having a physical body, and so on. In short, the alleged properties of the neutrino are consistent across cultural barriers, while the properties of God are not. Now consider the professional objectivity between the two camps. By and large, the physicists who perform research in neutrinos have little emotional stake in the outcomes of neutrino research. It makes no difference to these guys what mass, spin, or charge the neutrinos actually have, just so long as their understanding is justified by the data. Indeed, if one could even demonstrate that neutrinos never really existed in the first place, most physicists would be overjoyed by the prospect and promptly give up the neutrino concept with little hesitation. Errors in understanding are viewed as an opportunity to discover something new rather than something to be ashamed of. Religious advocates, on the other hand, have a profound emotional investment in their respective beliefs. Almost universally, religious sects promise indescribable torment in the afterlife for failing to follow the proper set of rules. It is even a common practice to define one's cultural identity through religious belief. Thus, right or wrong, admission of error is almost the psychological equivalent to an identity crisis. Proponents of the neutrino are therefore objective in their pursuit of knowledge, while theologians are heavily burdened with emotional bias. Another key difference between neutrinos and God revolves around the nature of detection. Whenever a neutrino is detected, the event is recorded by sensitive electronic instruments, and the results are independent of which side of the bed you woke up on that morning. On the other hand, manifestations of God are all purely subjective events that often require heavy psychological prepping. A classic example of this is the doctrine that faith precedes the miracle, meaning you have to assume God's existence a priori before ever experiencing actual signs of His existence. Believers regularly testify of God's voice in their hearts, while such experiences are openly withheld from the skeptical doubters. So while neutrino detections are independent of the mental state of the observer, faith generally seems to carry bizarre psychological prerequisites before generating manifestations. Now, think about the levels of quantifiable modeling that describe the two spheres. The neutrino is grounded in a sophisticated mathematical formalism based on quantum mechanics. Every aspect of the neutrino carries with it a set of governing equations that quantifiably predict its behavior under specific conditions. Conversely, God has none of these features to speak of. Nearly all standardized information we have about him comes from ancient texts written in the form of homilies, poetry, and parables. They make no quantifiable predictions about how God should behave under targeted stimulus, and offer no objective tools by which to even so much as demonstrate his very existence in the first place. Consequently, neutrinos possess a theoretical framework that is intrinsically quantifiable, predictable, and testable, while God doesn't. Finally, the neutrino is the one and only explanation for neutrino detection events. In the entire realm of theoretical physics, there does not exist any plausible alternative explanation for any of the events we associate with neutrinos. Yet every alleged detection that theologians associate with God may be readily explained through other means. Life-saving miracles are just as easily the result of good fortune, while feeling the Spirit is an event that sounds a lot like a simple psychological intrusion. Hearing God's audible voice may just as well be an auditory hallucination. Scriptures can readily be generated from human scribblings, and the conversion process as a whole is just a complex web of psychological manipulations. All of these alternative explanations are perfectly plausible in their own right, and even reproducible through experimental rigor. The neutrino is therefore the only thing that explains neutrino detections, while every supposed form of God detection is conceivably the result of perfectly natural events. So when put together, these essential differences are the reason why the neutrino is universally accepted as a real entity with real properties, while the very existence of God himself is widely rejected by a growing number of people. Of all the rules one might associate with rational belief, the neutrino follows them all with exquisite discipline, while God apparently fails every chance he can get. If anything, the real question we should be asking ourselves is, why do so many people still believe anyway, and very strongly at that, when the idea of God is so obviously a glorified fairy tale? Is it lack of education? Is it willful deception? Or perhaps a side effect of our intrinsic human nature? Whatever the answer is, we owe it to ourselves to understand this phenomenon and make certain we exercise only the highest standards of intellectual discipline in this endeavor.